General Marcus Whitfield had built his reputation on strict discipline and unwavering authority. At 52, he commanded the respect of every soldier under his command at Fort Davidson military base. His steel-gray eyes could silence a room, and his booming voice had made countless recruits stand straighter. He believed in order, hierarchy, and the absolute importance of following the chain of command. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds as General Whitfield made his routine inspection. Everything had to be perfect: uniforms pressed, boots polished, weapons clean. He had zero tolerance for sloppiness, and everyone knew it. His own military jacket displayed an impressive array of ribbons and medals earned through 30 years of dedicated service. Private Sarah Chen had arrived at the base 3 weeks ago, transferred from another division. She was quiet, competent, and kept to herself. What irritated the general was her seeming indifference to his authority. While other soldiers snapped to attention when he passed, she offered only the minimum required respect. Her salutes were technically correct but lacked the crisp enthusiasm he expected from his troops. During morning drills, General Whitfield watched Private Chen with growing annoyance. She performed every exercise flawlessly, her physical conditioning obviously superior to most recruits. Her marksmanship scores were exceptional, and she completed obstacle courses with an ease that suggested extensive training. Yet something about her demeanor suggested she was merely going through the motions. The breaking point came during a particularly challenging training exercise. The unit was practicing urban warfare scenarios in the mock city built on the base grounds. General Whitfield had designed the exercise to push his soldiers to their limits, testing both their physical capabilities and mental resilience under pressure. As the exercise progressed, Private Chen began making subtle adjustments to the plan tactics. She repositioned team members, altered communication protocols, and modified approach strategies. Her changes were small but significant, and General Whitfield noticed that her team was performing far better than the others. When he confronted her after the exercise, demanding to know why she had deviated from standard procedures, Private Chen simply stated that she saw opportunities for improvement. Her tone was respectful but confident, lacking the deference he expected from a private addressing a general. The general's face reddened with anger. Here was a private, barely 3 weeks on his base, questioning military tactics that had been refined over decades. He decided it was time to remind her exactly who was in charge and what happened to soldiers who thought they knew better than their commanding officers. That evening, General Whitfield called Private Chen to his office. The room was sparse but impressive, with military memorabilia covering the walls and a large American flag hanging behind his desk. He intended to deliver a lecture about respect, hierarchy, and the dangers of insubordination. Private Chen entered with perfect military bearing, standing at attention before his desk. The general began his prepared speech about discipline and the importance of following orders without question. He explained how the military functioned on a system of rank and respect, and how individual soldiers who thought they could improve upon established procedures were dangerous to unit cohesion. As he spoke, General Whitfield noticed something that made him pause. Private Chen's uniform, while regulation, seemed to fit her differently than it did other soldiers. There was something about the way she carried herself, a confidence that went beyond physical training. Her eyes, while respectfully focused ahead, held a depth of knowledge that seemed unusual for someone of her apparent age and rank. The general continued his lecture, but found himself studying her more carefully. Her hands, clasped behind her back, showed calluses consistent with extensive weapons training. Her posture was perfect, but it was the kind of perfect that came from years of practice, not weeks of basic training. When he finished speaking, Private Chen remained silent for a moment before asking permission to speak freely. The general, curious about what excuse she might offer, granted permission. What she said next would change everything he thought he knew about military service and the nature of true leadership. Private Chen explained that she had indeed noticed inefficiencies in the training protocols. She had extensive experience in similar operations and felt compelled to make adjustments that would better prepare the soldiers for real-world scenarios. Her tone remained respectful, but there was an underlying authority in her voice that seemed incongruous with her rank. General Whitfield's irritation grew as he listened. The audacity of this private, suggesting that his training methods needed improvement, was beyond acceptable. He decided that harsh disciplinary action was needed to remind not just Private Chen, but all his soldiers, about the importance of respecting rank and authority. He stood from behind his desk, towering over the smaller woman, and began outlining the consequences of her insubordination. Extra duties, confined to quarters, and a formal reprimand in her service record were just the beginning. He wanted to make an example that would echo throughout the entire base. As General Whitfield detailed her punishment, something shifted in Private Chen's demeanor. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Her stance remained regulation, but there was a new quality to her presence, as if she was making a decision about something important. She asked quietly if she could make a phone call before accepting her punishment. The general, thinking this might be a request to call family or a legal representative, was inclined to deny it. However, something in her tone suggested this was not a typical request. The phone call lasted only 3 minutes. Private Chen spoke quietly, mentioning her location and current situation. She used terms and references that General Whitfield couldn't quite catch, but the formality of her language suggested she was speaking to someone in an official capacity. After hanging up, Private Chen returned to her position in front of the general's desk. She informed him that someone would be arriving within the hour to clarify the situation. The way she said it suggested this was not a lawyer or family member, but someone from within the military structure. General Whitfield was puzzled but not concerned. He assumed she had contacted someone from her previous assignment who might vouch for her character. While this was unusual, he was confident that whatever explanation might be offered, it would not change the fundamental issue of a private questioning a general's authority. The hour passed slowly. General Whitfield used the time to prepare documentation for Private Chen's disciplinary action. He reviewed her service record, which showed only her current assignment and a brief notation about her transfer from another division. The record was surprisingly sparse for someone who demonstrated such advanced skills. When the knock came at his office door, General Whitfield expected to see another officer, perhaps a colonel or major who had worked with Private Chen previously. Instead, a civilian entered, wearing a simple business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. The man introduced himself as David Morrison from the Department of Defense. He was polite but serious, and asked if he could speak privately with General Whitfield about Private Chen's situation. The general agreed, curious about what a DoD representative might have to say about a disciplinary matter involving a private. Mr. Morrison opened his briefcase and removed several documents. He explained that Private Chen's assignment to Fort Davidson was part of a classified program, and that her true background was not reflected in the service record General Whitfield had access to. The documents he presented would clarify the situation, but they required the highest security clearance to review. General Whitfield's confidence began to waver as he examined his clearance level and compared it to the requirements for the documents. For the first time in his career, he encountered military paperwork that was classified above his access level. The implications of this began to dawn on him as Mr. Morrison prepared to reveal information that would completely reshape his understanding of the soldier he had been lecturing about discipline and respect. The revelation was about to begin, and General Whitfield sensed that everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy was about to be challenged in ways he had never imagined. The woman standing at attention in his office was not who she appeared to be, and the consequences of his assumptions were about to become clear in the most uncomfortable way possible. Mr. Morrison carefully arranged the classified documents on General Whitfield's desk, each one marked with security classifications that made the general increasingly uncomfortable. The highest classification level he had ever encountered in his 30-year career was now spread before him like a puzzle he wasn't qualified to solve. The first document Morrison showed him was Private Chen's actual service record. As the general's eyes scanned the pages, his expression changed from confusion to disbelief to something approaching shock. The woman he had been lecturing about military discipline had served in operations across 3 continents, led successful missions in hostile territories, and received commendations from military leaders whose names were legendary within the armed forces. Colonel Sarah Chen had graduated at the top of her class from West Point 15 years ago. She had completed advanced training in psychological operations, strategic planning, and international relations. Her record showed deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and several locations that were still classified. She had earned the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and the Distinguished Service Cross. General Whitfield looked up from the documents to stare at the woman still standing at attention in his office. The private's uniform suddenly seemed like a costume, and her patient's silence took on an entirely different meaning. She had been allowing him to lecture her about military discipline while possessing more combat experience and tactical knowledge than most of his staff combined. Morrison continued revealing information that made the general's stomach sink further. Colonel Chen was not just any decorated officer. She was a specialist in military intelligence and psychological operations. Her current assignment at Fort Davidson was part of an undercover evaluation of training protocols and base security measures. The Department of Defense had been receiving reports about potential inefficiencies at various training facilities. Rather than conducting obvious inspections that might prompt temporary improvements, they had developed a program where highly qualified officers would assume lower ranks and observe operations from within. Colonel Chen's mission was to identify weaknesses in training, security, and leadership effectiveness. General Whitfield realized he had been under evaluation for 3 weeks without knowing it. Every interaction with Private Chen, every training exercise she had observed, every moment he had demonstrated his leadership style had been carefully noted and would be included in her report to the Pentagon. Morrison explained that Colonel Chen's suggestions during the urban warfare exercise had not been insubordination, but rather corrections based on real-world experience. Her modifications to the training protocols were informed by actual combat situations she had encountered in overseas operations. The improvements she had made were exactly the kind of insights the evaluation program was designed to capture. The general's mind raced as he recalled every conversation, every order he had given, every moment he had treated her as just another recruit. His lecture about respect and hierarchy suddenly seemed not just inappropriate, but potentially career-ending. He had just spent an hour explaining military discipline to an officer whose understanding of military operations exceeded his own. Morrison reached for another document, explaining that Colonel Chen's evaluation would assess not just operational efficiency, but leadership quality. How commanding officers treated subordinates, their willingness to consider input from lower ranks, and their ability to recognize talent regardless of apparent hierarchy were all factors in the assessment. General Whitfield asked weakly if Colonel Chen had been documenting their interactions. Morrison confirmed that detailed reports had been filed throughout her 3-week assignment. The general's handling of her suggestions, his dismissive attitude toward her expertise, and, particularly this evening's disciplinary lecture had all been recorded. The most devastating revelation came when Morrison explained that Colonel Chen's phone call had been to her actual commanding officer at the Pentagon. She had requested permission to reveal her true identity because the evaluation had reached a point where maintaining her cover would compromise the mission's objectives. General Whitfield understood the implications immediately. His treatment of someone he believed to be a private had revealed his true character as a leader. An officer secure in his authority and confident in his abilities would have listened to good suggestions regardless of their source. Instead, he had demonstrated exactly the kind of rigid thinking that the evaluation program was designed to identify and correct. Colonel Chen remained motionless during Morrison's explanations, but the general could now see her differently. Her perfect military bearing was not that of a well-trained recruit, but of an experienced officer maintaining discipline in an awkward situation. Her respectful silence was not submission, but professional courtesy towards someone who had unknowingly placed himself in an embarrassing position. Morrison gathered the documents and explained that Colonel Chen's mission at Fort Davidson was now complete. Her report would be submitted within 48 hours, and the Department of Defense would make decisions about necessary changes to training protocols and personnel assignments based on her findings. The general asked hesitantly about the consequences for his own career. Morrison's response was diplomatically neutral, explaining that personnel decisions were above his security clearance level. However, he noted that the military valued leaders who could adapt and learn from experience, suggesting that how General Whitfield responded to this revelation might influence future evaluations. After Morrison left, General Whitfield found himself alone with Colonel Chen for the first time since learning her true identity. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. and he struggled to find appropriate words for the situation. Colonel Chen spoke first, her tone professional but not unkind. She explained that the evaluation program was not designed to end careers, but to identify areas where the military could improve its effectiveness. Her observations at Fort Davidson had revealed both strengths and weaknesses in the base's operations. She acknowledged that her deception had created an uncomfortable situation, but emphasized that authentic leadership behavior could only be observed when people believed they were interacting with genuine subordinates. If General Whitfield had known her true rank, his behavior would have been different, making the evaluation meaningless. The colonel outlined some of her key observations about the base's training programs. While the physical conditioning and basic military skills instruction were excellent, there were opportunities to incorporate more real-world tactical scenarios. The modifications she had suggested during the urban warfare exercise were based on lessons learned from actual combat operations. More significantly, she had observed inconsistencies in how different officers treated soldiers of various ranks. Some leaders, she noted, demonstrated the kind of mentorship and respect that brought out the best in their subordinates. Others relied primarily on authority and intimidation, which could be effective in the short term but failed to develop independent thinking and leadership potential in the soldiers under their command. General Whitfield asked directly how his own leadership had been evaluated. Colonel Chen's response was honest but tactful. She acknowledged his technical competence and the respect his soldiers showed for his authority. However, she had noted his reluctance to consider input from lower ranks and his tendency to view questions or suggestions as challenges to his authority rather than opportunities for improvement. The conversation that followed was unlike any the general had experienced in his career. Colonel Chen shared examples from her overseas deployments where junior officers and enlisted personnel had provided insights that saved lives and improved mission outcomes. She explained how the most effective military leaders she had encountered were those who could maintain authority while remaining open to good ideas regardless of their source. As they talked, General Whitfield began to understand that his assumptions about military hierarchy had been too rigid. Authority and respect were not incompatible with listening and learning. The best leaders, Colonel Chen explained, were those who could inspire loyalty through competence and fairness rather than fear and intimidation. The colonel also revealed that her apparent indifference to his authority had been carefully calculated. She needed to present suggestions and observe responses without being dismissed simply because of her supposed rank. Her respectful but confident demeanor had been designed to test whether good ideas would be considered based on their merit rather than their source. General Whitfield realized that this conversation represented a turning point in his career. He could either view Colonel Chen's evaluation as an unfair deception that had embarrassed him, or he could treat it as an opportunity to become a better leader. The choice would determine not just how her final report read, but how he developed as an officer for the remainder of his military service. The evening was far from over, and the most important part of this encounter was yet to come. How General Whitfield chose to respond to this revelation would ultimately define his character and determine his future in the military leadership structure he had served faithfully for 3 decades. The silence in General Whitfield's office stretched for what felt like an eternity after Colonel Chen finished explaining the evaluation program. The general sat behind his desk, processing the complete reversal of everything he had believed about the previous 3 weeks. The woman before him was no longer Private Chen, the insubordinate recruit who needed discipline, but Colonel Chen, an experienced officer whose assessment could determine his future. General Whitfield's first instinct was defensiveness. He wanted to argue that any commander would have responded similarly to what appeared to be insubordination from a private. But, as he looked at Colonel Chen's composed expression, he realized that defensiveness would only confirm the negative aspects of his leadership that she had already observed and documented. Instead, he chose a different approach. General Whitfield asked Colonel Chen to help him understand exactly what she had observed and how he might improve. This request surprised her, as many officers in similar situations had chosen to focus on the unfairness of the evaluation method rather than the lessons it might provide. Colonel Chen explained that her observations had revealed a pattern in his leadership style that was common among experienced officers. General Whitfield had developed effective methods for maintaining discipline and ensuring mission completion, but he had become increasingly isolated from the practical insights of the soldiers under his command. She described specific instances where his dismissive responses to questions or suggestions had discouraged soldiers from sharing observations that might have improved operations. While his authority was unquestioned, the environment he created was one where soldiers focused on avoiding mistakes rather than finding opportunities for improvement. Colonel Chen shared an example from her deployment in Afghanistan where a young corporal had noticed an inconsistency in local civilian behavior that indicated a potential ambush. The commanding officer's willingness to listen to this observation, despite its source being a junior enlisted soldier, had prevented casualties and led to the successful completion of their mission. She contrasted this with situations she had observed at Fort Davidson, where soldiers with potentially valuable insights had remained silent because the command climate discouraged input from lower ranks. This was not uncommon, she explained, but it represented a missed opportunity for operational improvement and professional development of junior personnel. General Whitfield began to see his leadership through a new lens. He had always prided himself on maintaining high standards and ensuring immediate compliance with orders. However, he was starting to understand that this approach might have unintended consequences for the overall effectiveness of his command. Colonel Chen suggested that they walk through the base together so she could show him examples of what she had observed. This tour would be different from his usual inspections, focused not on compliance and appearance, but on the subtle dynamics of leadership and communication that affected unit effectiveness. Their first stop was the Communications Center, where Colonel Chen pointed out how the duty officer interacted with the enlisted personnel under his supervision. She had noticed that Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior communications specialist, often had suggestions for improving message routing efficiency, but rarely shared them because previous attempts had been dismissed as inappropriate for his rank to suggest. Colonel Chen arranged for General Whitfield to speak privately with Sergeant Rodriguez about his ideas. What the general heard surprised him. The sergeant had developed modifications to their communication protocols that could reduce message transmission time by 15% and improve security through better encryption key management. These were exactly the kinds of improvements that General Whitfield wanted to see in his command, but he realized he had unknowingly created an environment where they remained hidden. Sergeant Rodriguez explained that he had assumed his ideas would be unwelcome because junior personnel were expected to follow procedures, not suggest changes to them. Their next stop was the motor pool, where Colonel Chen had observed similar dynamics. Corporal Washington, a mechanic with extensive civilian experience, had identified potential improvements to vehicle maintenance schedules that could extend equipment life and reduce repair costs. However, she had never formally submitted these suggestions because she believed they would be viewed as questioning established procedures. General Whitfield spent time discussing Corporal Washington's ideas and found them technically sound and potentially valuable. He began to understand that his command contained a wealth of practical knowledge and innovative thinking that he had been inadvertently suppressing through his rigid adherence to hierarchical communication patterns. As they continued their tour, Colonel Chen explained how effective leaders in combat zones had learned to tap into the collective intelligence of their units. She described commanders who held regular sessions where soldiers of all ranks could suggest improvements, and how these leaders had achieved superior results through collaborative problem solving. The contrast with his own methods was clear to General Whitfield. He had focused on ensuring that his soldiers could execute orders efficiently, but had neglected to create opportunities for them to contribute to the development of better orders. His leadership style was producing compliance, but not engagement or innovation. Colonel Chen also showed him examples of positive leadership she had observed on the base. Lieutenant Martinez, who supervised physical training programs, had developed an approach that encouraged soldiers to share fitness techniques they had learned elsewhere. This had resulted in improved overall conditioning and higher morale in his units. Captain Thompson, who ran the weapons training programs, regularly asked his soldiers about their experiences with different equipment and incorporated their feedback into training protocols. His units consistently achieved higher proficiency scores than those trained using standardized methods alone. These examples demonstrated that effective leadership could maintain authority and discipline while still being open to input and improvement. General Whitfield began to see that his assumption about hierarchy requiring one-way communication was limiting his effectiveness as a commander. As evening approached, Colonel Chen suggested they visit the enlisted dining facility, where informal conversations often revealed the true state of morale and unit effectiveness. General Whitfield rarely spent time in this environment, preferring to eat in the officers' mess where conversations were more formal and filtered. Sitting among the enlisted personnel, General Whitfield heard conversations that provided insights into how his leadership was perceived throughout the base. The soldiers respected his competence and fairness in disciplinary matters, but many felt disconnected from the decision-making processes that affected their daily duties. Colonel Chen pointed out that this disconnect was not necessarily harmful in traditional military operations, but it became a significant weakness when units needed to adapt quickly to changing conditions or when innovative solutions were required for complex problems. She shared examples from special operations units where success depended on every team member being able to contribute tactical insights and adapt plans in real time. These units maintained strict discipline and clear command structures while also encouraging collaborative thinking and shared problem-solving. The conversation gradually shifted from analysis of problems to discussion of solutions. Colonel Chen offered specific suggestions for modifying General Whitfield's leadership approach without compromising his authority or the base's operational effectiveness. She recommended implementing regular feedback sessions where soldiers could suggest operational improvements, establishing mentorship programs that paired experienced personnel with newer arrivals regardless of rank, and creating opportunities for cross-training that would expose soldiers to different perspectives and approaches. General Whitfield found himself genuinely interested in these suggestions and began asking detailed questions about implementation. For the first time in the evening, he was engaging with Colonel Chen not as the subject of an evaluation, but as a fellow officer seeking to improve his effectiveness. This shift in their dynamic marked a crucial moment in the general's development. He was beginning to understand that true leadership strength came not from avoiding challenges to his authority, but from being secure enough in his position to welcome good ideas regardless of their source. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation for change had been established. General Whitfield was starting to see the evaluation program not as an attack on his competence, but as an opportunity to become the kind of leader he had always aspired to be. The final phase of this encounter would determine whether this initial openness to change could develop into lasting improvement in his leadership approach and his relationship with the soldiers under his command. 3 months after Colonel Chen's revelation, Fort Davidson had become a different kind of military installation. General Whitfield stood in the same office where he had learned about the evaluation program, but the changes that had occurred since that evening were evident in every aspect of base operations. The transformation had not happened overnight. In the weeks following Colonel Chen's departure, General Whitfield had struggled with implementing the changes he knew were necessary. His initial attempts to encourage input from lower ranks had been met with suspicion from soldiers who were unsure whether this represented a genuine change or a temporary experiment. Sergeant Rodriguez had been the first to test the new climate when General Whitfield specifically asked for his communication protocol suggestions. The successful implementation of Rodriguez's ideas had demonstrated to the entire base that the general's request for input was sincere. Word spread quickly through the enlisted ranks that their commanding officer was genuinely interested in their insights and experiences. The breakthrough came during a training exercise similar to the one where Colonel Chen had first caught General Whitfield's attention. This time, when Corporal Washington suggested a modification to vehicle positioning that would improve tactical advantages, the general stopped the exercise to discuss her recommendation with the entire unit. The discussion that followed revealed that several soldiers had observations about the exercise setup, but had assumed their input would be unwelcome. General Whitfield realized that changing his leadership approach required more than just announcing his willingness to listen. He needed to actively demonstrate that input from all ranks was valued and would be seriously considered. He began implementing weekly sessions called tactical reviews where soldiers could present suggestions for improving any aspect of base operations. Initially, attendance was sparse and comments were cautious. However, as soldiers saw their suggestions being implemented and credited, participation increased dramatically. The first major success came from Private Johnson, a former civilian mechanic who proposed modifications to the base's vehicle maintenance procedures. His suggestions, when tested, reduced maintenance time by 20% and improved vehicle reliability. General Whitfield made sure Johnson's contribution was recognized in base communications and recommended him for accelerated promotion consideration. Similar success stories began accumulating as soldiers realized their experience and knowledge were genuinely valued. The base's efficiency improved measurably as practical insights were incorporated into standard procedures. More importantly, morale increased significantly as soldiers felt more engaged in their duties and connected to the mission's success. General Whitfield's relationship with his officers also evolved during this period. He began sharing decision-making processes more openly, explaining the reasoning behind orders and seeking input on implementation strategies. This approach initially made some officers uncomfortable, as they were accustomed to receiving directions without discussion. Captain Thompson adapted quickly to the new approach and found that involving his subordinates in planning made his units more effective. His weapons training programs became models for other bases when soldiers who helped develop the protocols achieved consistently superior performance scores. Lieutenant Martinez discovered that encouraging soldiers to contribute to physical training programs not only improved fitness results but also reduced disciplinary problems. Soldiers who felt invested in their training were more motivated and required less supervision to maintain standards. The most significant change occurred in how the base handled problem-solving when unexpected challenges arose. Previously, issues were addressed through the chain of command with solutions developed by senior officers and implemented by enlisted personnel. The new approach involved collaborative problem-solving sessions that drew on experience from all levels. When a security protocol needed updating after a change in threat assessments, General Whitfield convened a mixed-rank team to develop solutions. The team included officers with strategic training, senior enlisted personnel with operational experience, and newer soldiers who brought fresh perspectives to established procedures. The resulting security improvements were more comprehensive and practical than anything developed using traditional top-down methods. The collaborative process also ensured that everyone understood the reasoning behind the changes, making implementation more effective and compliance more consistent. General Whitfield's personal growth during this period was evident to everyone on the base. He became more approachable without losing authority, more flexible without compromising standards, and more inclusive without diminishing his responsibility for final decisions. His confidence grew as he realized that seeking input from subordinates actually strengthened rather than weakened his leadership position. The real test of these changes came when Fort Davidson was selected for a major training exercise involving multiple units from different bases. General Whitfield's command was assigned to coordinate logistics for the exercise, a complex task that would test every aspect of their operational efficiency. Rather than relying solely on his staff officers to develop plans, General Whitfield implemented a planning process that incorporated insights from soldiers at every level. Supply personnel contributed practical knowledge about equipment requirements, communication specialists provided input on coordination protocols, and training instructors offered suggestions for realistic scenario development. The exercise was completed ahead of schedule with fewer logistical problems than any similar event in the base's history. More significantly, visiting commanders commented on the exceptional morale and initiative displayed by Fort Davidson personnel. Soldiers who felt valued and heard performed with enthusiasm that was rare in routine military exercises. 6 months after Colonel Chen's evaluation, General Whitfield received notification that he was being considered for promotion to brigadier general. The recommendation cited his innovative leadership approaches and the measurable improvements in base efficiency and personnel development that had occurred under his command. More meaningful to General Whitfield was a letter he received from Colonel Chen, who had completed similar evaluations at 3 other bases. She wrote that the transformation at Fort Davidson exceeded anything she had observed in her evaluation career. The changes he had implemented were being studied as a model for leadership development throughout the military. Colonel Chen's letter included specific examples of how soldiers from Fort Davidson were performing when transferred to other assignments. Their initiative, problem-solving abilities, and collaborative attitudes were making positive impressions at bases throughout the military system. They had learned to think beyond mere compliance with orders and were contributing innovative solutions wherever they served. The letter also revealed that General Whitfield's initial response to learning about the evaluation program had been unusual. Most commanders who discovered they had been assessed became defensive and focused on the deception rather than the insights the evaluation provided. His willingness to learn and change had been noted by senior military leadership as evidence of exceptional character and potential. General Whitfield reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The evening when he had planned to discipline Private Chen for insubordination now seemed like a lifetime ago. The rigid thinking that had initially led him to view her suggestions as challenges to his authority had been replaced by an understanding that true leadership meant bringing out the best in everyone under his command. He had learned that military hierarchy and discipline were not incompatible with collaborative problem-solving and inclusive decision-making. Authority based on rank was important, but authority based on competence and respect was more effective in achieving mission objectives and developing personnel. The base's success had not come from abandoning military traditions, but from adapting those traditions to make better use of human resources and collective intelligence. Discipline remained essential, but it was now discipline focused on achieving excellence rather than merely ensuring compliance. As General Whitfield prepared for his next assignment, he knew that the lessons learned from Colonel Chen's evaluation would guide his leadership for the remainder of his career. He had discovered that the strongest leaders were those secure enough in their authority to welcome challenges and confident enough in their competence to admit when others had better ideas. The transformation of Fort Davidson demonstrated that military effectiveness could be enhanced when leaders created environments where every soldier felt valued, heard, and empowered to contribute to mission success. This was the kind of leadership the modern military needed, and General Whitfield was proud to be part of developing and demonstrating its potential. The story that began with a general's plan to discipline an insubordinate private had evolved into a fundamental change in understanding what military leadership could accomplish when it embraced the full potential of every person in uniform.